By 1932, the third round of armed resistance to British by revolutionaries had already come to a grinding halt. The first had been the Savarkar, Aurobindo Ghosh generation, then there had been the Gadarite period, and then the Hindustan Republican Army. But by 1932, almost all the leaders of these revolts had either been killed or hanged, or had been arrested, and a handful of them had escaped abroad, as in the case of Raj Bihari Bose. So there was a fair amount of despondency amongst the revolutionaries. This is, however, also a time when Marxist and communist ideas began to spread in India among the revolutionaries. Now, it is very important here to reiterate that although Bhagat Singh, who had been a part of the previous round of revolutionary activity, had become towards the end of his life a Marxist, he is not the origin of the communist movement in India. The movement he belonged to was certainly a nationalist movement. It was not a communist movement, even though it had been renamed Hindustan Socialist Republican Association by Bhagat Singh towards the end of the previous decade. The origins, therefore, lie somewhere else, and specifically with a person called M.N. Roy. Now, M.N. Roy had been a part of the efforts by Bagha Jotin in the First World War, when he had attempted to get arms from the Germans, landed in Odisha coast. And M.N. Roy had kind of been Bagha Jotin's agent in Indonesia. Now, when that particular episode collapsed, M.N. Roy escaped to the Americas, where he basically got radicalized by communist ideas. He helped set up the Mexican Communist Party, and he spent some time in and around Berkeley, and then he went across and landed up in the Soviet Union, which had just been founded, and Lenin gave him the job of trying to organize Indian revolutionaries and trying to indoctrinate them with Marxist-Leninist ideas. So the Communist Party of India was essentially set up in Tashkent around 1920, and it was set up by essentially bringing on board revolutionaries who, after the First World War, had nowhere to go, because many of them had been backed by the Germans, and now that Germany had been defeated, they had nowhere to go. So they all gathered here and they were being indoctrinated. However, in the 1920s, this group didn't do very much, and it's only really towards the end of the decade, many of them now began to come back to India and began to infiltrate the system, the revolutionary movement. And in the very beginning, they also began to do things not too dissimilar to what the previous generation of revolutionaries had attempted to do, which was the occasional act of revolt, perhaps trying to infiltrate the British Indian Army and so on. However, most of these attempts did not succeed at all. So the communists decided to change tack completely, and the track change happened as a result of this movement essentially being captured by British communists led by Rajni Palme Dutt, who was possibly a double agent. So Rajni Palme Dutt began put forward a thesis along with another of his British colleagues, which is called the Dutt-Bradley thesis, which was that rather than expend communist energy on trying to oppose the British, they should actually infiltrate the Congress Party and the Revolutionary Party and try and capture them, rather than trying to expend their limited effort in trying to oppose such a powerful government. And so you begin to see the communists begin to infiltrate both the Congress with their ideas and also the revolutionary movement. Now, one thing that happens here that is quite strange, which is difficult to explain, is that the British authorities, for whatever reason, were quite happy to allow Marxist ideas to spread in the jails that they controlled, particularly amongst the revolutionaries. So interestingly, many of the revolutionaries who had gone into jail as nationalists came out as communists. So very often you will hear that there was a large communist element in the revolutionary resistance to British rule. That is not quite the case. What happened is that many of the revolutionaries, when they were actually actively resisting British rule, had been nationalists. It's when they went into jail that they became communists. So it was not the communists, not as communists, that they resisted British rule. And this particular strategy turned out to be a good idea, as we will see, because the Second World War would come and the communists, particularly the Soviet Union, would become an ally with the British against the Axis powers.